Hello, everybody. It's great to see you all here. It's really exciting to be having this webinar series on open source verification. My name is Henrietta Wilson. I research weapons regulations, and I'm really pleased to have a chance to work with Olamide Samuel and Dan Plesh at SOAS on this project. I also should give a big thanks to the technical team at SOAS, in particular Fadil El Abid and the Scrap volunteers for helping make this all happen. So open source verification, we take this to mean any systems that track activities using open source data or tools, and that's done by non-governmental groups or individuals. Like last time, we've got another fantastic set of speakers showcasing a really diverse set of open source verification activities in terms of the sorts of organisations that are doing it, the sorts of things that they're tracking, and the ways that they're tracking them. And before I introduce the speakers properly, I'm going to say a few words about the overriding aims of these webinars and a brief summary of the discussion points from the first webinar. So the series has been motivated with the aim of really finding out what's going on in open source verification around the world, with the understanding that technologies have transformed what can be seen around the world and who can see it. We also want to explore the possible wider significance of these isolated projects in terms of, are there possible synergies between them? Are there overlaps in the challenges that they could mutually face and help solve? And whether it can be worth thinking about these things as components of a bigger global tracking system, and if there are benefits or difficulties with doing that. The first webinar that we had, I will post the details of that in the chat in a moment, but it was a really interesting set of discussions about specific methods, specific projects, but also about wider issues. So some challenges that were picked up on in the first webinar were about disinformation and the extent to which this really muddies the task of open source verification, whether it's new, the extent to which it can be overcome, the extent to which we are overcoming it right now. Commentators also highlighted issues around authenticating data that's generated from open source techniques, and that it's very important for the credibility of the results that they're authenticated in some way. Alongside that, the projects that we spoke to were very clear that they had systems in place for authenticating their own data, so there was this interesting dynamic going on there. There are also discussions about the purpose that open source verification can serve. A lot of people felt very strongly that these sorts of activities can't replace traditionally negotiated verification regimes that are generally part of bigger treaties. In contrast to that, or maybe in complement to that, there was a sense that it's not intended to replace traditional verification. Rather, these sorts of activities are intended to empower individuals to make the changes they need to make, and support the wider verification regimes, the traditional verification regimes. So a very interesting set of conversations that maybe we'll carry forward through this webinar, or maybe we'll think about completely new things. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to hand over shortly to 4 speakers. Throughout the webinar, I would like you to, anybody to make comments or questions via the chat function. If possible, please do give me your name and affiliation, and I'll be harvesting those and presenting them to the speakers when I can. The webinar is being recorded and we'll publish it on the SOAS YouTube channel, and it will finish at 3. So our speakers today, I'm really grateful to them. I'm aware that for already very busy people, a global pandemic is an especially busy time. We're going to start with Idrees Ahmad from the University of Stirling, and then hand over to Geoffrey Duke if he's available, although I'm not sure if he's signed up yet, but I'll be checking that. And Eric Herring, who's a professor of world politics at Bristol University, whose background is in international security and who now works primarily on locally led development in Somalia. And we'll finish off with Pavel Podvig from UNIDIR, whose background is related to nuclear weapons, nuclear proliferation, and who is involved with the Russian nuclear forces. So thank you very much for hearing me out. Idrees, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So my involvement with open source started because of the conflict in Syria. I've been monitoring it from the beginning. And one of the things that I noticed very early was that there was this kind of disinformation assault, which I hadn't seen in the past. I've covered many conflicts in the past in Israel-Palestine, which very often is a source of great disinformation, and also the one in Iraq. But in all of those conflicts, ultimately it was possible to get to some kind of a truth. But here, what was happening was that in the case of Syria, that there was this almost deluge of disinformation that would surround every incident that would happen. And at the beginning of the conflict, it was possible for journalists to go and verify. So the most famous first incident that happened, famous in the sense that the first massacre that happened in Syria, as soon as it happened, it got sort of tied up in these claims and counterclaims. And there was a massacre in a village called Hula, and 108 people had been killed. But what happened is that pretty soon a counter narrative emerged, and it was placed through different channels. And the claim was made that no, it was actually the rebels who carried out the massacre themselves in order to get Western sympathy or Western intervention. But that was the time when journalists were still present in Syria on the ground. So several journalists were able to, one from Channel 4 in the UK, and then from Der Spiegel, Christoph Reuter, they were able to go in, interview people, and also look at the circumstances and verify very quickly that, well, the counterclaims are absolutely false. So that was cleared up soon enough. But this was around the same time when Marie Colvin was killed, and the regime then started making it very difficult for any journalist to start entering. And this is the time when more and more the reliance became on people who are on the ground. They would shoot videos or somebody would take pictures, and journalists became more and more dependent on Skype calls, WhatsApp, and all these other manners in which they could communicate. But then the question of verifiability emerged, that how do you verify all these videos or images that were coming out? So that is where it became really essential that some kind of a method emerged, a verifiable method through which things could be validated. That it's not just that you could say that an image is authentic, but somebody else should be able to replicate your results. And I think that that's where the OSINT community, as it emerged, so it started doing this really immeasurable service. Now, there were clearly cases after that in which OSINT did some really, I would just mention briefly, one of the case studies, which was quite illustrative for me. There was obviously the first major chemical attack, which was similarly embroiled in all kinds of claims, counterclaims, even though the facts became obvious rather quickly enough. Later on, there was the one in Khan Sheikhoun. Now, this one is quite interesting to me because I was involved in monitoring this from the beginning. And it was very quickly obvious what had happened, because by this time in Syria, there were all kinds of people who were gathering this type of information. There were people on the ground. There was something called the sentinels who were posted along hilltops who would monitor an incoming air raid, and they would monitor communication. So there was that data. There was data from NATO, which was monitoring the same airspace. And so the jet had been tracked. There were people on the ground who had witnessed it. There were samples collected from the survivors. So all of this painted a certain picture, and which was a pretty hard picture to dismiss. But very soon, a big counteroffensive emerged, in a disinformation counteroffensive. And the reason why this becomes really problematic is it's not just that it's the government behind it. It's not the Syrian regime making a counterclaim, but or the Russian media making a counterclaim. They also then find amplifiers in the West, and some journalists participated in that, some academics participated in that, and as a result of it, it appeared like there's this big controversy around it. But eventually, the things that we had found right at the beginning, at the time I had this debate with Noam Chomsky, the a very influential media scholar, and as a result of it, I ended up writing that how Chomsky was, he at the time was amplifying these doubts. And I mentioned that the reason why he's citing are quite improbable. And I explained the reasons because there was all this mass of data. And I wrote about it, and a few months later, then the OPCW validated everything that was known from the beginning, because there was also a Guardian journalist who had visited on the ground and verified some of the physical claims. So anyway, at that time, the OSINT information became quite crucial. Now, the need for open source had been known for quite some time. 9/11 Commission, after the, in its findings, and later on the Iraq Intelligence Commission, they had said at the time, because one of the things that they noticed is that in the gathering of intelligence, most intelligence agencies were relying on methods which were not keeping up with the available information that could be secured through much easier ways, because it's out in the public. There were images that could be verified, that could be used, and there were other data that could be used that was out in the public sphere, which could then be put together to paint a picture. But what happened is that this whole, around 2010 onwards, this whole subculture started emerging, and it had some distinctive traits which I thought were which made it distinct from something like WikiLeaks, because WikiLeaks had a very non-transparent model, and it was not always clear what the sources were or how it was, and what were the criteria through which it was being vetted and distributed. And then the 2016 election became an example in how it could become a source for siphoning disinformation. But this was very different. This culture was very much part of the whole open source movement, which included things like Wikipedia and even open source software. So the thing that set it apart was its transparency. That it's not just that you would find something, but you would also put your methods out. That here's how I got at it, and you can use the same methods to test that whether you reach the same conclusions or not. And I think that's what distinguished it. And the first thing that they did was obviously in any of these events is validating the information itself. So to give you a quick example of the kind of confusions that can emerge. So when there was the attack in Khan Sheikhoun and there was the chemical attack in Ghouta, so what happened is that there were YouTube videos that came out. And the Russian government soon said, well, this can't be correct, because look at the timestamps. These videos were posted a day ahead, because the timestamp said, that it was still April 3rd when the event had taken place on April 4th. So clearly this is all false information, except there was an obvious reason for it, that all the timestamps are recorded in California, where YouTube is headquartered. And so because of that, the date is 8 hours, it's actually 9 hours behind, so the timestamps. And so Amnesty International then, because of all this, was able to then develop a tool, it's on their website, where you can always put in a YouTube video and it gives you its actual timestamp by location, that which part of the world it's coming from. So that was one way that information was validated. And it was also some of the other features which made it quite distinct was there was kind of also a sense of responsibility, which was crucial to your credibility within the community. So to give you another example, in Aleppo, there was this little girl who became a focus of propaganda, who was posting out videos. She and her mother would post pictures of the destruction and everything during the siege. But then it became this whole campaign started discrediting the girl and saying that she was maybe not even there, and that the information that she was posting was fake and it was staged or it was from somewhere else. But what happened is that through open source verification and geolocation, folks from actually with some friends of mine and who are with Bellingcat and who were able to verify the girl's location, and we were also able to verify which Wi-Fi networks were being used and everything. So all the information was available, but it wasn't released until the girl was safely out of the siege, because if it was released ahead of time, the girl was actually being targeted, and their home had already been destroyed. So that's why, to protect her, until she was safely out, this information wasn't put out. So there was a kind of a sense of responsibility, which was also different. There was also a culture of sharing. So there's, if you go on Twitter, there's a hashtag called Thursday Quiz, in which the open source community, what it does is that it posts out a challenge, either to find a location or either to do something, some other task. And so all these various open source adepts, they go about, and whoever gets the answer, they then explain that what steps they went through in order to reach their conclusion. So it's a kind of a information and method sharing culture, which again distinguishes it, and I think it's the positive aspect of it. And there's that emphasis on sharing, verifiability, replicability. But I think that what makes it so essential for now, considering especially in conflicts where access is difficult, is that it answers, the open source environment answers the most enduring questions of journalism, the 5 W's, the what, when, where, why, the factual questions. And I think that that can be interpreted in various ways. But the thing is that the facts, the integrity of the facts can only be verified with some kind of a rigorous method, which the mainstream media considering. Now, most of them have created fact-checking departments. Some publications used to have them, but now there's more investment in that. But I think that it was ignored for a long time. And I think that that's making a big difference, that there's now greater emphasis on verifiability, on integrity of information. And I think that that has been generally a healthy contribution. Obviously, it's not going to replace journalism, but what it will do is it is supplementing journalism and sometimes challenging journalism. And I think that that is what makes open source right now. To me, it has been, I see it as a mainly positive. Well, that's not to say that it doesn't have negative uses. I mean, we have seen in the US, the alt-right use open source techniques to do all kinds of doxing people and doing various kinds of things which, you know, we would question. So obviously it is something that can be misused, but in terms of the mainstream manifestation, Human Rights Watch has now got an open source section, Amnesty International, and New York Times has got its visual investigations department. I think that those are things which are positive contributions, but I wouldn't say that obviously it's a tool like any other that it will always be necessarily used for the positive. I think I'll end there. And
thank you. Absolutely. Really interesting insight into all sorts of things that you've been involved with, and also some of the issues that span open source sorts of stuff. So I'll pick out, again, you're picking out this sense of disinformation makes it much harder. We had it in the last webinar, but that also it enforces the open source practitioners to develop systems for authenticating their own data, which are growing organically from the community. And I wonder, we'll come back to this in the questions, and I'll hand over to the next speaker soon, but I'm interested to see the extent to which it's true across all open source verification, and if there's something to do, if there's something to be developed about a code of practice for people doing this sort of work. Yeah, but thank you very much.
If I would just make a brief kind of addition, that in terms of there is an open source community, and then there's open source methods which have been adopted by right now security companies, and there are all these private consultancies which are using them. Obviously, their intention or what they intend to do with it is very different than what the mainstream kind of this community, the OSINT community, is doing with it. Yes,
thank you, Idrees. Yeah, great. I'm now going to hand over to Geoffrey Duke from the South Sudan Action Network on Small Arms. And I understand you've joined the meeting now, Geoffrey. Hello, Geoffrey. I can't hear you.
Hello.
Hello. Nice to see you. Over to you to tell us about your
experience.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a small problem of network. I'm not sure if it's going to remain stable, but I hope that it thanks to me. Thank you very much. Delighted to join the conversation. I'm going to talk more about what happens at the local level in terms of open source data collection, verification, and the use of this information that is collected. One thing for start is that there is various sources of open source. I mean, data that is relevant to our kind of work, which is disarmament and security, humanitarian disarmament, and related instruments. But I will have my focus more on small arms and light weapons as something that is giving my country a bigger headache than nuclear weapons and all other, conventional arms. So how do we find information about small arms and light weapons, and what are the legal constraints around the transfer of arms to a country like South Sudan, which has been in war for the past 5 years or so? As some of you might be aware about, some of the organizations doing research every now and then, and some collecting real-time information like, ACLED. There is a small arms survey that also provides research and data sharing about arms tracking, identification, and responsible information sharing. And then there's the Idrees by Conflict Armament Research project funded by the EU. They all, provide us with the tools for verifying information around the responsible or the irresponsible transfer of arms in this region. But then the major problem in terms of this data that we collect is what happens after verification. It's a major challenge to the civil society community, because for activists and data collectors in Global South, there is a real big issue, as highlighted by the previous speaker, of safety. How do you verify information and share it in a fashion that does not put you at risk? So as you may all know, the issue of what happens after data is verified is not only a regional or South Sudan specific, but it's a global challenge in world politics. For example, even with an arms embargo on South Sudan in 2018, Conflict Armament Research established that Uganda procured arms and ammunition from 3 European countries, and that is in light of an existing arms embargo. Now, when the information came out in a Conflict Armament Research report, no one was there to take action. Uganda was the end, the destination, for the end use, and the papers were clean, but these weapons were later on found in South Sudan. But then what takes place after that is what is a bit confusing, because we don't see a standard like if somebody violates an arms embargo, these are the clear things that are going to, the actions that will be taken against them. And it's even related to the issue of violations and circumventing certain provisions in the Arms Trade Treaty. Like if a country is found to have diverted arms, what happens within the context of the Arms Trade Treaty? So that is the big question that I would like to come with, and see how the open source and verification community can take the conversation forward. Like, is there any way we can galvanize some kind of consensus about a few steps that could be relied on after verification? Now, I would love to highlight a few of the way forwards in terms of advancing data collection, verification, and responsible sharing. And one is how we can pull together data sources of various on various themes and disarmament instruments. Like, how do we grow expertise and make it cheap and sustainable to collect data around a number of major themes, like small arms and light weapons, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and etc. As highlighted by the previous speaker, also, if we do not grow the expertise and make it cheaper, it's not going to be sustainable for the data to continue coming up in the open source for us to be able to verify and use it. Now, the second is what to trust and what not to trust. This now revolves also more around who may be a trusted source, but then at some point, publishes data that causes confusion. That how do we in this space of information flowing so fast, how do we make sure that there are sets of instruments that we can use easily and quickly to verify data before action on it, and how fast a country or a regional economic community reacts on data varies. Therefore, there needs to be some level of consensus on how and what to trust, and how do we verify this kind of information with different degrees of confidence. I would also emphasize the safety of data collectors, especially in the global south, as we grow the expertise of a community of data collectors. How do we also grow a global, solidarity and security protocol that can keep data collectors safe, especially in the global south? In that fashion, even if somebody has information, they won't be afraid to share it with sources for further verification and possibly further action. I'm saying this out of experiences of a number of civil society colleagues who shared information about arms in intercommunal violence, not only in South Sudan, but across the region of Horn of Africa. And sharing such information can, in the end, the verification and tracing process can trace these weapons back to specific persons in the government, and that implicates such people. So thereby attracting insecurity to these activists. So how do we keep them safe? I would
great, Geoffrey. I'm going to
stop there for now.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I'm going to stop there for now. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really
I want to stop there for now. Thank you.
Really interesting insight into real on the ground challenges. I think it's fascinating and concerning the issues you raise around safety of the community of people doing the tracking. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Eric Herring about his project in Somalia. Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Henrietta. Okay, Somalia is not a very obvious place to be talking about nuclear security. However, if you speak to a Somali, they will get very exercised about the subject, because it's an established fact that in the 1980s and especially the 1990s, the Italian eco-mafia had explicit and developed plans to dump nuclear waste and and toxic waste inland in Somalia and off the coast of Somalia. I do say that's an established fact. It's been investigated and people have been prosecuted for it. In Italy, there's a massive investigation in Italy over many years of this. So that the fact of this is not in doubt. what has never been established is whether or not any nuclear materials were actually then dumped in Somalia, inland or off its coast. I've done quite a lot of work on this, going through what's available, and there are some kind of key candidate locations that you would look if you wanted to find this out. And I worked with colleagues here, including Tom Scott, who monitors radiation everywhere from Chernobyl to Fukushima. He's one of the world's leading radiation monitoring people using drones, and Jaap Veldhuis, who designs radiation detectors. But in terms of the conversation you're having today, the specific aspect that you're interested in is, because many Somalis have said to me that they wish this could be looked into, I set up this team to think about how would you look into this, and indeed how could you involve the public in this process. And our team adapted the Crayfish app, which is actually really about solar radiation and so on, and adapted it so that it could be used as a mobile phone radiation dosimetry app that could be used as a free download. And we tested this at CERN. It definitely works. And the idea is that anyone with a smartphone could download the app, film a suspect object from more than one angle. It could be automatically uploaded to our database. And if it was something was radioactive, it would actually affect the digital image in very subtle ways that our software could analyze and work out the strength of the radiation. So in that sense, there's an element of openness. I should say it's only kind of partly open because it's not the information you give straight back to the member of the public, because that could be used for nefarious purposes. Now, it may be that in the end, what we find is that there are no such materials available. And this would be a major contribution to finally resolving this in Somali history either way, about is there anything there now? And I know Somalia has its many problems and challenges, but what's really struck me over my years of involvement with Somalis is this really matters to people, because what they feel is that their country has been the subject of all sorts of foreign predations over the years, and they would like to take control of their own environment. And one of the ways of doing this would be to crowdsource this kind of reporting of suspect objects. So that, for example, if one of the fishing vessels pulls up an object that they're worried about, they could film the object using the app. Once they get within range of the mobile phone network, it would automatically upload. They could dump the object back in the sea. We would have it time-stamped and geolocated. The water would be good shielding. So there's a lot of ways in which this has got advantages. In terms of where we are with this, so we've established this work, we've discussed it with the IEA and the federal government, and so we're fundamentally in place with what a system could do, and it's really it's all about the process now of Somalia joining the IEA and establishing the capability. But that's broadly where we're coming from. The other things that are relevant here is that Somalia has significant uranium resources, not in terms of a world scale, but in terms of materials that are close to the surface, that again are not under any kind of regulation or control. If Somalia wants to become member of the IEA, it has to have a nuclear security regime, and that requires it to have a means of controlling the nuclear materials within its borders. Currently, it doesn't have those. Can you share my screen for a second? In fact, actually, I might just switch this over here. Why isn't it dragging?
You're able to share screen. I think I'll give you.
Can you see that now? Are you?
Green button at the center. If you press that, so you'll be able to share your screen.
The green button at the bottom.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Where has it gone? So apologies. Yeah, you can see this now?
No.
You can't see it now. You can't see the map now.
No, it's not.
I
Even
can't,
looking at the map.
Yeah.
Okay. That's very odd. Okay. I'm going to have to give up on this. I have no idea why you can't see it. Okay, I'll just give up. If you're interested, okay, so I was going to show you a map of the relevant locations in Somalia, but so apologies for my Zoom incompetence. This is the first time I've ever had to try and share something. So if you wanted to have a look at the map or look at the article in more detail, then it's in a journal called Global Security, Health, Science and Policy, and it's in 2020. You can have a look at it there. Okay, I'll hand back now.
Thank you, Eric. I'm now just trying to get the other, I'm trying to get the link into the chat thing. So thank you very much. I'll do that shortly. Really interesting, another really exciting sort of insight into the scope of open source techniques for meeting community challenges that maybe have not been addressed and have been ignored for many years. And this sense that embedded in what you're doing is protecting the people that are doing it, as well as the longer term security functions. So thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Pavel Podvig from UNIDIR, who's going to give some broader insights into open source work. Thank you, Pavel.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for attending. I'm coming from a slightly different field, mostly nuclear strategic arms control and nuclear proliferation. And I guess every field has its own open source analysis and open source techniques, but they are largely similar across the field. So, and their nuclear weapons and everything nuclear is usually pretty well hidden, but nevertheless there has been quite a bit of good work that has been done over the years, and I think it is now we can now see and maybe draw some lessons from this field and from other fields as well. So first, since the title of the event includes verification, I think we should be careful, and this is something that Henrietta already mentioned, that it may not be the verification that we are talking about here, because verification is very clearly defined as an activity that is linked to a specific obligation under a specific treaty or an agreement. And if we look at the way that verification is defined, one particularly useful definition is that it is a set of activities, whether national or cooperative, tools, procedures, and fundamentally judgment about what is happening with regard to certain obligations in the certain agreement. And if we look at it from this point of view, it is clear that open source analysis is definitely one of those tools that are used. And in normal or regular arms control treaties, open source is definitely one of the tools that states use to make their judgments. But it's only part of the picture. And it is important to keep in mind that verification is a fundamentally political process. And I would say the open source analysis is also a political process. It's not just data. the judgment that you make about this data is a very important part of the picture. And if we look at the experience with verification that we've accumulated over the years, I think one lesson is that verification is most effective when it is done as a cooperative activity. When people on the ground are working together, they know each other, they know their own attitudes, biases, and they build trust, which is extremely important because the trust actually comes from data, and it also comes from the relationships that people forge. And this is definitely one of the areas where the open source analysis, or many of its examples, is probably has a weakness. You can watch something on a satellite image, but you may not necessarily know what it is that people are have in mind when they do this or that, and that makes the process actually vulnerable to all kind of a political manipulations, if you will, and not necessarily intentional, in fact, because for some people, for example, a couple of containers that are that appeared on the rocket test site is a sign of something sinister, but maybe these are just containers. Maybe someone is moving out or something like that. So this is definitely there is an area that is for vulnerabilities. It's not necessarily a fatal problem for open source analysis, because you can imagine ways to kind of alleviate that. But by working with the local experts who know the situation on the ground, but it's something that needs to be kept in mind. One more aspect of open source analysis that I want to talk about today is that there is in the last several years, maybe, you can see that there is a certain kind of an interesting interaction between open source community. Sometimes, I'm not claiming that this is a normal practice, but sometimes we see that open source analysis is built around certain intelligence data that are kind of leaked into the public. And in a way, it is still open source, and sometimes it's very good work, no doubt about that. But in a way, you see that it is validated by the fact that it is kind of implicitly or sort of gets a nod from a government and or from intelligence services. And the problem here is, well, it is, of course, makes the process open to manipulation to a larger extent, but this is something you could watch for. And again, there are ways to make sure that the analysis itself is solid. And I think Idrees mentioned that there is a community that are built around there, that idea. But to me, an important aspect of this kind of symbiosis is that it ineffectively and very often it gets governments off the hook. It kind of makes it possible for them to avoid kind of presenting the evidence and presenting it in full force. And sometimes the evidence may not be as strong as this kind of a indirect way of releasing it suggests. And which again does not necessarily make the analysis wrong, but it is clearly makes it vulnerable to a challenge. And we've seen that in many occasions that you could this kind of way creates could create confusion, and they could be manipulated with all kind of actors with all kind of intentions. And this is I think an unfortunate part of the situation. Transparency, of course, would help. Transparency with open source analysis, as always, transparency helps. But it only can go. It can only go that far, especially when people start using very elaborate methods and tools like software, the face recognition, or some tools that detect image manipulation and things like that. Some of these are not particularly transparent, and in fact, but you can see the kind of a reverse effect. Sometimes people, when you see open source analysis uses this kind of a sophisticated quote unquote tools, that is somehow seen as a lending credibility to the analysis, although maybe that's the that's maybe the time to kind of step back and say, well, maybe we should be more careful about conclusions. And again, this is not to say that this kind of interaction is necessarily a fatal flaw, but I think this is something that the community and everybody who looks at the results of open source analysis should be aware of, and we should make sure that we are not creating a situation where all kind of actors feel less responsible for what they do. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Pavel. What, again, well, you've managed to sum up a whole bunch of additional things to think of. So I'm noticing we haven't had many questions or comments yet from the audience. So please, everybody, do feel free to post any questions you've got. In the meantime, I'm going to be asking the questions. I get to choose the questions to ask. I could go in all sorts of directions with all of you, but I'm going to give you each one question and then go back through the speaking order to give you a chance to reflect a bit more. I'm aware that time's getting a bit tight, so this section will not be long in any case. Idrees, your talk spanned a huge variety of regions and positions and political processes, it seemed to me. There's a set of conversations happening around SOAS about the extent to which it's possible or desirable to think in terms of a global tracking system that brings together different communities. And I'm going to put it to you, if you think that's a sensible way to think about it or desirable, or if it's better to keep it as isolated activities. Geoffrey, again, really interesting things that you gave us there. You spoke about the challenges of enforcement, I think, and this sense that, so if you find things that are violating existing regulations, the Arms Trade Treaty or whatever, what do you do then? And I'd be really interested to hear more about that. In particular in the context that I think these sorts of conversations have been happening within traditional verification regimes. There's been a constant question after attribution, what do you do when you find a violation? Eric, what a fantastic pragmatic project is going on to try and empower Somali citizens. I'm wondering if you see, it's a similar question to Idrees, is there scope for scaling this up, joining it up to make it accessible to other people, or is that not really the point of what you're doing? And Pavel, you gave all sorts of interesting insights into the bigger things that are going on. You pointed out that open source, one of the many things that I could pick out here, is there a problem? Does open source verification get governments off the hook? Are citizens doing things that government should be doing? Which feels like a really interesting counterpoint to the sort of conversations we were having in the last webinar about the fact that open source cannot replace conventional verification. And you're seeming to imply that maybe governments might start thinking it would replace conventional verification, which has never really been the object. So I'll stop talking and ask Idrees to come in on my very rushed questions.
I think one of the key features of the open source community has been reliance on crowdsourcing. If you have seen that BBC investigation, Africa Eye investigation about this extrajudicial killing of 2 women and 2 children in Cameroon. So that investigation was able to get, made it possible to have some justice. It still hasn't happened fully, but some accountability. And that would not have happened without some degree of crowdsourcing, because it was actually the public that was able to help identify the geographical features of the location in which this incident had happened. So I think that one of the strengths of open source has been the ability to rely on crowds across borders. Sometimes it's just a necessity of time when you're pressed for time, and you're up at 4 a.m. and that's morning somewhere else. So the thing is that who's available, who can do the work. So I think that there's strength in that ability to be able to collaborate with people who are across different geographies, and sometimes that also gives you legal protection, because there are things that you can say within one jurisdiction, but that information can certainly be used by your allies outside that jurisdiction. So I think that sometimes that's also a way to bypass any kind of local restrictions. So I think that there are mainly in collaborative work, and also in this kind of transnational collaborative work, many Eastern European projects, especially working on anti-corruption work, and also the sort of like the interlocking of states and various types of business mafias. So they also rely on this fact that they have allies in places where journalists have more protection, that who can amplify the same information. So I think that, there mainly I see strengths, but if there are any negative sides, I'm sure there are some, which can be in the future. I mean, you can kind of take those into account and find some kind of measures against them, but mainly I think that it's a positive thing.
Thank you. That's great. So there's opportunities for going global through communities interacting with each other, possibly, but a limitation on that because some people can't do it. They don't have the protections. Yeah. Thank you. I could go off again, but I'll hand it over to Geoffrey. And I'll also point out we've got another question from a participant, from Anant. Thank you, Anant. How can we get, I'll just put it out for anybody who wants to answer, how can we get buy-in from states for this set of activities? Yeah, Geoffrey, would you like to come back with any responses about enforcement? Ooh.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so on enforcement, we may all know at this point, like Pavel also shed light on it, that it is essentially a political process. That's why we do not see like clear, enforcement mechanisms into the instruments like the Arms Trade Treaty, like the arms embargo, like what happens, when it's broken. However, we can use information that we have got for, appealing to organizations that matter most in terms of the relevant instruments. For example, in the case of an EU arms embargo that has been broken by both Uganda and Sudan in the context of the South Sudanese conflict, and also seeing that the EU is pouring millions of euros in at helping to address the humanitarian aid, we could make sense. And it's something that we have engaged with them on. If your arms embargo is inadequate in terms of stopping arms from reaching to South Sudan, and you know that these arms are fueling conflict in South Sudan, how do you still continue and remain comfortable giving millions in humanitarian aid? But the rest of the bold decisions, what to do next, we leave it to them, since it's an essentially political process. But we just wish that the instruments could grow a little more too, like the Arms Trade Treaty and this arms embargo coming up from the Security Council, but unfortunately not. I'll stop there for now.
Right, and I'm sure you're not alone. I think many people would like some of these things to have more teeth, but that sense of internationally negotiated provisions, it's very hard to get these things in place. Thank you, Geoffrey. Eric, have you got any thoughts about scaling up?
Yeah. So, and I want to link it to Anant's great question about states being secretive about their security activities. So how could they possibly, how does that work with open source verification? So sometimes the state doesn't control everything that's happening. And so open source verification happens whether a state likes it or not. In other situations, they can collaborate. In relation to extending the kind of activity that we're doing in Somalia, it fundamentally is based on a long-established relationship of trust that you build up over years of involvement with people and with successive governments. So I think the idea of simply taking the kind of thing you're doing in one country and just scaling up elsewhere, I think isn't really how it works. You've got to embed whatever technical technique you have in a set of social relations that may or may not enable that, and will always require it to be adapted. But we've got more potential for what we're doing is to actually extend it in these sort of activities into different areas of work. Because once you have a system whereby you're gathering crowdsourced data on one subject, then, and that's proven to work, you can actually gather it in relation to significant others, whether it be drought, whether it be sort of weather, climate action, and so on. And so you can build out from there. And that's certainly what we've been already working on.
Great, very interesting again, and there's a really interesting theme I think emerging through all the talks today. For me, the sense of trust. We've heard Idrees talking about communities, getting to know each other. We heard Geoffrey talking about how important it is to build up trusted relationships with people to collect information that way. And I think that's a really neat way of thinking about scaling up. Maybe not going wider geographically, but going deeper, using what you've got to get better and better data over more areas. Yeah, thank you. Pavel, I'm going to hand you over. There's just a couple of minutes left, I'm afraid, but it'd be really great to hear your final remarks.
Very briefly, I think it is definitely citizens should be able to hold governments accountable for their actions. In that sense, the open source community does a great job, and it has a role. I think however, open source community and citizens should not or should be aware that sometimes the governments want to use them to pursue their own agenda, and that's again, this is something you could have guards to make sure that this is not happening. But that's something to be aware of and to be on guard.
Right. Okay. Sorry, I misunderstood your original point then. Yeah, about the replacing. So that's a very interesting. That's maybe another setting ways in which disinformation really complicates open source verification. That people can be played, citizens, in the sort of data. But maybe the sort of systems we've heard from Idrees and Geoffrey and Eric for being very careful how you build the community and how you collect the data can be one way to address that. I'm not saying that's easy, and I'm not saying that it's equally possible in all places in the world, but maybe there are systems that can address that. So it's just time now to wind up by thanking everybody all extremely for your insight, your time, for the audience for being part of this. Idrees, Geoffrey, Eric and Pavel, you've given us so many interesting things to think about, and I hope this will feed into the wider set of conversations we're having about open source verification. Just a couple of things to mention. The recording of this will be on the SOAS YouTube channel. The URL for that will be circulated at some time afterwards. The next webinar on this theme in this series is going to be on the 9th of September, and it will be advertised on the SOAS CISD events page. We'll send information about that out when we can. And thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. See you soon. Bye.